Thank you, Brennan, for the introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, I would ask that you hold your questions and comments until the end of the lecture. In defense of the polemicist, if our discourse would succeed, then it must inspire men and women toward the act of polemics, which is to say, it must provoke a man or woman to courage. What is a polemicist? A polemicist, in the broadest possible sense, is a man or woman who speaks. But speaking in this context is not the same as speaking in every other context. To speak as a polemicist is to speak against. That is, against the proclamation or proposition. It is to speak contrary, which is to say, it is the act of contradicting the positive or negative premise. Who is the polemicist? The polemicist, in the highest possible moral sense, is a man or woman of courage. To perform the act of contradiction presupposes a disposition of courage, because contradiction implies confrontation. There are other words that convey our meaning: disputant, controversialist, contrarian. Or if you're one for formal definitions, in French, polemicist comes from the word polémique, meaning controversial, and from the Greek, polemikos, meaning warlike or hostile. Perhaps this is what led the thinker George Novak to define polemics in the following way. A polemic is a militant reply in the form of reasoned arguments to attacks upon a position or proposition worthy of defense. This can be mild in manner or muted in tone, as academic etiquette requires, or harsh and vigorous as necessity may dictate. What is decisive is not the manner, but the gist of the matter. Have the pros and cons of the question been trenchantly set forth so that the issues at stake become clarified by the confrontation of opposing views? From Merriam-Webster, we derive the following: a strong written or spoken attack against someone else's opinions, beliefs, practices, etc. The art or practice of using language to defend or harshly criticize something or someone. From the Oxford English Dictionary, a controversial argument or discussion. Argument against some opinion or doctrine, etc. One who writes or argues in opposition to another. Two notions stand out as being distinct: to defend and the idea of arguing against. Is the act of defense legitimate? Should we refrain from arguing against something in order to avoid confrontation? As the German philosopher Gadamer says, one can say something tactfully, but that will always mean that one passes over something tactfully and leaves it unsaid. And it is tactless to express what one can only pass over. But to pass over something does not mean to avert one's gaze from it, but to keep an eye on it in such a way that rather than knock into it, one slips by it. Thus, tact helps one to preserve distance. It avoids the offensive, the intrusive, the violation of the intimate sphere of the person. The polemicist is offensive precisely because the polemicist is intrusive. In the best possible sense, the polemicist can be said to shatter delusion. In the worst possible sense, he can be said to violate the intimate sphere of the person. It is the arrogance of scholars and academics that they want to tell us not only how to think, but also how to live. The notion is that we should conform to their taste because their taste is best. A man is berated and belittled if he speaks for himself. He is rebuked and bullied if he does not speak after the manner of academics. How dare you have the audacity to form your own thoughts? Don't you know you need our context? We tell you what counts when you speak, for we are the keepers and creators of knowledge. As if these men would say to us, there is no new thing but the things we call new. If a thought was great, they say, then surely we would have already known about it. But why should a man subject himself to this? The context of the polemicist is one who challenges authority. He is not merely the puppet of those who would tell him what to think, but has enough courage to resist the pressure of the crowd, has enough courage to speak out and cut against the grain of the establishment, but most of all, to perform the act of the question. If we would profit from the polemicist, then we must permit him to ask the thing we fear. It is perhaps interesting that we cannot get to the identity of the polemicist until we find one who complains. That is to say, the polemicist is defined in contrast. If there is one trait that marks the polemicist in the context of community, it is the act of complaint. Where complaint exists, there we find the polemicist. And we complain about the polemicist because we harbor an emotional resentment against his procedure of contradiction. We feel the need to complain in response to the wound he has given us. But is this complaint truly warranted? Between tact and honesty, how far do we go in crushing delusions? Here we can gain some footing as soon as we admit that not all delusions are healthy. What is a polemicist? A polemicist is a kind of dialectical revolutionary. And it may very well be true that if a man would be a revolutionary, he must also be a polemicist. But by default, a polemicist is automatically a revolutionary. To defend the polemicist, therefore, is to defend the act of revolution. But what is the act of revolution, if not the act of resisting, the act of contradicting the established assumptions of a given order? The polemicist is the opposite of the tyrant. The tyrant fears the question and therefore feels the need to suppress it. His methodology is not dialectical, but that of brute force. His response is simply to censor. He is afraid to let the polemicist speak, lest he contradict his sacred premise. Where the tyrant fears the question and would be the enemy of all those who use it, the polemicist proceeds by way of question. He is the advocate of the question because he knows the question to be an act, which is to say, an agent of salvation. But salvation from what? In the broadest possible sense, we might say salvation from error. And the polemicist is hated for this very reason, because by disrupting the foundation, he destroys the beauty of the structure. But in this context, we must call such beauty false. The polemicist is an evil, wicked man, some would say. He is merely a hot-headed antagonist. We should not look at his objection, but rather examine the effects of his method. After all, these men say, how much pain does he bring with his question? Ideas that we love die hard, and no one is more suited to this purpose than the polemicist. What then can be said in his defense? Many men have scorned him. They have tortured his body in order to get at his mind. But this did not refute the thing he said. It did not negate the question. Though one can kill the polemicist, his question in dialectical context will ultimately remain. For some people, this may be a hard truth to grasp, but the point here is that the polemicist speaks in a certain context, and to silence the polemicist by force is to abandon this context, is to commit equivocation against the very thing he would seek to maintain. This is not a true act of refutation. In the same context, the polemicist raised his objection, but is instead an evasion of the polemicist's intellectual force by means of physical equivocation. Or as Milton has said, when a man hath been laboring the hardest labor in the deep mines of knowledge, hath furnished out his findings in all their equipage, drawn forth his reasons as it were a battle ranged, scattered and defeated all objections in his way, calls out his adversary into the plain, offers him the advantage of wind and sun, if he please, only that he may try the matter by dint of argument. For his opponents then to skulk, to lay ambushments, to keep a narrow bridge of licensing where the challenger should pass, though it be valor enough in soldiership, is but weakness and cowardice in the wars of truth. A polemicist is a soldier in the war of truth. And in this realm, victory can only come by means of refutation. To meet mental force with physical force is ultimately to evade the power of the question. We have touched on this idea that the polemicist is a destroyer of false beauty. But if he is a destroyer of false beauty, then surely he must be the bringer of true beauty. This is not to say that the notion of truth is unproblematic, exceedingly complex, but for the sake of utility, we choose to speak in general terms. The polemicist, in the most positive sense, is a destroyer of false values and dangerous ideals. He would offer men a step they could not see or were too enamored with their ideology to accept. He directs the discourse by asking the question, but not all questions are profitable, which means a polemicist can equally drive us in a destructive direction. Some men simply struggle to get at the assumption behind the question, and some men will never be able to get at the assumption behind the question. Of course, this is the genius of the Socratic method, that it exposes the vital assumption behind the premise with the force of its inquiry. To attack a premise in true Socratic form, one must attack the assumption behind the question. This is as easy as asking the question, what does the premise assume? And as difficult as being able to identify the assumption behind the premise, which one could also call the premise behind the premise. What about this idea that the polemicist is dangerous? Who speaks this way? Who says these kind of things? What is the motivation of such a man or woman? Is the polemicist dangerous? Has he violated some sacred command by contradicting the premise? We say Socrates was correct when delivering his apology. He should have been all the more valued in his society for the benefits his method conferred on his society. The polemicist is someone we need. He is the complement of society. So far from being our enemy, the polemicist is our friend. In the climax of isolated dialectic, we must learn to play the part of the polemicist for ourselves. But not only this, we must learn to reevaluate the polemicist in light of what his polemic would accomplish. And this is the true defense of the polemicist, which is to say, an evaluation of the worth of his polemic. For herein not only lies the substance of the polemicist's power, but also the justification of his dialectical war. Perhaps the highest act of polemics is to be a polemicist unto oneself. What have we gained from our clash with the polemicist is a question we must ask if we would truly evaluate the polemicist. In the aftermath of this war, we must always remember to look back and examine what we have learned. What do polemics do? In a word, they expose the assumption behind the premise. But this is merely a technical description. What do polemics do? They disrupt the dangerous sphere of the self. But what does this mean? What do we mean by the dangerous sphere of the self? The greatest enemy that stands before us is none other than the self. We are the deceivers of ourselves. And this deception proceeds from the intimate sphere of the self, which is the same reason it is so hard to transcend. In this context, the self is the prisoner of the self. But polemics have the power to invade this sphere, not only to shake things up, they have the power to help us transcend this sphere, to close distance where distance is dangerous, to create distance where distance is needed. We need the voice of contradiction to counteract the voice of affirmation. Without this, a man has no defense against his assertions. The polemicist is a man or woman who comes to us, and they are polemical because they bring contradiction. In many respects, the polemicist is a man or woman who attacks us. That is to say, they assault the omniscient sphere of the self. At one time, man told himself that he was the product of the gods. And when he did this, he placed himself below the gods. He lived in subjection to his own creation. He was the maker of his own bondage. But one day, a warrior came from the wilderness. He stormed the town with his blazing torch, and when the people would speak of God, he would raise his torch to their eyes. One after the other, they would go blind. The light would put out their sight. But in time, after their eyes adjusted, they could hear what the warrior was saying. In the dark, the people could only affirm their own voice. But when the warrior shone his light, he asked the people, "Where are these gods that you should obey them?" And the light of this question put out their sight. But this blindness was only temporary. In time, they adjusted to the light and emerged from the darkness of their cave. With new and stronger eyes, they could now see the world. Our warrior is none other than the polemicist, which is to say, a liberator, a breaker of false values and false ideals. Values and ideals which have long kept men in bondage. He is the surgeon of reality, and even if reality is myth, he is still the agent of contrast, even as his vocation serves the most vital existential purpose, that of a more precise, or at least more relevant, conscious realization. To quote Aristotle, "We should be grateful not only to those with whose views we may agree, but also to those who have expressed more superficial views, for these also contribute something by developing before us the powers of thought." John Stuart Mill has put forth a similar expression in his essay on liberty. "The peculiar evil of silencing the expression of an opinion is that it is robbing the human race, posterity as well as the existing generation, those who dissent from the opinion still more than those who hold it. If the opinion is right, they are deprived of the opportunity of exchanging error for truth. If wrong, they lose what is almost as great a benefit, the clearer perception and livelier impression of truth produced by its collision with error. It is the power of the polemical that it not only serves the individual's freedom, but stands for the emancipation and development of the whole human race. This rare procedure of confrontation is set up to challenge mankind's untruth. It moves in such a way that it transforms the person by undoing mankind's infallible precepts. And from this singular confrontation is realized a plural transformation. Herein is contained nothing less than the intellectual history of the human race. Perhaps the strongest defense of the polemicist is simply to note that this man or woman is not our enemy, but in the most proficient sense, in the most beneficial sense, this man or woman is our friend. This means the polemicist must confront the person she loves. This implies a virtue to polemics. Polemics can be a form of love, but not only this, they are the obligation of love. To quote the late Christopher Hitchens, one must have the nerve to assert that, while people are entitled to their illusions, they are not entitled to a limitless enjoyment of them, and they are not entitled to impose them on others. Allow a friend to believe in a bogus prospectus or a false promise, and you cease, after a short while, to be a friend at all. How dare you intervene? As well ask, how dare you not? Are you so sure you know better? Ask yourself this question 1,000 times. But if you are sure, have the confidence and dignity to say so. Remember that saying nothing is also a decision, and that the relativists and non-judgmental have made up their minds just as much, if not as firmly. This is simply another way of reminding you that if you decide to pass judgments and make criticism and take forward positions, you both can and should expect a few hearings to convene on yourself. To be a polemicist does not mean that one hates people, though we admit polemics can be a cloak for anger. To be a polemicist means that one loves the person. But perhaps the more difficult question we can ask ourselves in relation to confrontation is how far we should go to destroy delusions. For surely there must be a limit. And yet, as intelligent men and women, we have our own obligation to the polemicist. Is it truly so evil to be contradicted? I say it takes a mature mind to let go of the thing it loves when that thing is found to be in error. Perhaps this process is painful, as a bright light burning the eyes. But the polemicist does not do us a disservice, even though his confrontation may wound us. I submit to you that we obtain the most value from the polemicist when we realize not how uncomfortable he has made us, but when we realize his confrontation was in our favor. Some confront men out of contention, seeking to add strife to their bonds, while others confront men out of love, seeking to build up the person in compassion. But motive is not the justification we should seek. We should not merely judge the polemicist by the maturity of his motive, but we should discern the value of his polemic on the basis of how much closer it brings us to the truth in contrast with our present state. That is to say, even if this closeness is a drawing, and even if this drawing seems to be, metaphorically speaking, a violent, bloody, dragging. Violence itself is not enough to refute the polemicist. The question is whether what he said is truer than the thing he seeks to contradict. To once again quote the words of Mill, "A person who derives all his instruction from teachers and books, even if he escape the besetting temptation of contenting himself with cram, is under no compulsion to hear both sides. Accordingly, it is far from a frequent accomplishment, even among thinkers, to know both sides. And the weakest part of what everybody says in defense of his opinion is what he intends as a reply to antagonists. It is the fashion of the present time to disparage negative logic. That which points out weaknesses in theory are errors in practice, without establishing positive truths. Such negative criticism would indeed be poor enough as an ultimate result, but as a means to attaining any positive knowledge or conviction worthy of the name, it cannot be valued too highly. And until people are again systematically trained to it, there will be few great thinkers and a low general average of intellect in any but the mathematical and physical departments of speculation. On any other subject, no one's opinions deserve the name of knowledge, except so far as he has either had forced upon him by others, or gone through of himself the same mental process which would have been required of him in carrying on an active controversy with opponents. That, therefore, which when absent is so indispensable, but so difficult to create, how worse than absurd is it to forego when spontaneously offering itself? If there are any persons who contest a received opinion, or who will do so if law or opinion will let them, let us thank them for it and open our minds to listen to them, and rejoice that there is someone to do for us what we otherwise ought, if we have any regard for either the certainty or the vitality of our convictions, to do with much greater labor for ourselves." The polemicist, in the most exceptional sense, is he or she that does the impossible. "I will consider your thoughts," he says. "I will take your thoughts so serious that I may even form an objection. Could a man or woman ever present us with a higher intellectual compliment?" And what is the result of this meditation, this intelligent criticism, if not emancipation from the private sphere? The same sphere that would have destroyed us and left us in the bondage of false ideals. How many great men have been broken by their allegiance to the gods? Which is a kind of analogy for all the false ideals man has and would place above himself. The false ideals he would create and then serve. Behold the tragedy of a wasted life. We would choke on our own breath without new air. The polemicist brings to us not only fresh air, but open space in contrast to our stale and confined room. The most extraordinary aspect of the work of the polemicist is this idea of accomplishing the impossible, which is to say, performing the thing we could not perform ourselves, to liberate ourselves from the bondage of ourselves. A wise man will understand that this not only makes the polemicist necessary, but that it equally links us to the structure of community, and that the polemicist is to every solitary man and woman a life gift of community. If we are powerless to see the flaw in our reason, then we have need of the vision of another. And it is precisely at this point that the polemicist comes to us as an agent of liberation. He would not merely restore us by his work, but elevate us beyond our stale dogma. And what would life be without this vital contrast of emancipation? What would life be without the work of the polemicist? If we could liken all of mankind to an individual, and we were to seal him in a dark cave, he would be the prisoner of his own thoughts. It is only in the voice of the other that we find the voice of salvation. And perhaps the great terror here is that we are the thing from which we must be saved. Without the polemicist, man is the prisoner of himself. Thank you for listening.